On November 11, 2024, a jury in Fort Wayne, Indiana returned a verdict in a case that had remained unsolved for nearly 8 years. Guilty on all 4 counts, 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of felony murder while committing an attempted kidnapping. The defendant, Richard Matthew Allen, was convicted of killing 2 girls whose deaths on February 13, 2017 had generated one of the most documented crime investigations in recent American memory. This channel isn't about rumors. It's not about shock value. It's about evidence and the moments where the truth begins to crack. I'm Marcus Webb, and if you're new here, subscribe and join us. We're building something serious, and your support allows us to research deeper, produce better, and uncover stories others overlook. Like, share, and be part of it. The conviction appeared to bring closure to a case that had publicly stalled since the earliest days of the investigation. News outlets reported the verdict as resolution. Families offered statements of gratitude that the uncertainty had finally ended. A maximum sentence was imposed, 130 years, to be served consecutively. In the official record, the case was closed. But the finality of the verdict did not resolve the questions that had accumulated during 8 years of investigation and 2 weeks of trial. It did not explain why a tip containing the suspect's name was lost in a filing box for over 5 years. It did not clarify why a man who had provided his alibi within hours of the crime remained under investigation until a volunteer file clerk recovered the misfiled document. It did not account for the absence of DNA evidence, fingerprint evidence, or forensic trace linking the defendant to either victim or crime scene. And it did not answer what remains the most direct question in the case. What happened to Abigail Williams and Liberty German in the wooded area beneath Monon High Bridge on an afternoon in February, and exactly how? We know, with certainty, what was recorded. At 2:13 in the afternoon on February 13, 2017, a 14-year-old girl named Liberty German held up her iPhone and recorded 35 to 40 seconds of video on the Monon High Bridge Trail in Delphi, Indiana. In that video, a man can be seen walking behind her and her 13-year-old friend. His face is not fully visible. The audio captures a male voice saying the words, "Guys, down the hill." Moments after the video ends, one girl is heard saying the word, "gun." Less than 20 minutes later, at 2:32 in the afternoon, Liberty German's Apple Health application logged her last movement of the day. The next morning, search volunteers found the 2 girls in a densely wooded area on the north side of Deer Creek, approximately a quarter-mile from where that video was recorded. Their bodies bore deep cuts to the throat. Large amounts of blood were present at the scene. Clothing items from both girls were found scattered in the creek itself. By the afternoon of February 14th, the case had all the appearance of a thoroughly documented crime. Video evidence showing the suspect, audio evidence capturing his voice, and a crime scene that had left a clear forensic record. Yet it would take until October 2022, nearly 6 years later, before anyone was arrested. The investigation that followed the discovery of those bodies began with momentum. Within days, law enforcement released the audio recording to the public. A reward was offered. The FBI became involved. But the momentum did not translate to investigative progress. By July of 2017, police had released a composite sketch based on eyewitness accounts. The sketch showed an older man with a goatee. The case remained open, but the active investigation phase was ending. What had seemed like a straightforward evidentiary situation, a crime clearly documented by the victim's own phone, transformed into a cold case within months. For 5 years and 7 months, the case sat in that state. The video remained public. The audio remained public. The evidence was not lost or forgotten. Yet no arrest came. Detectives pursued alternative leads. The property owner nearby was investigated extensively. Composite sketches were revised. In April of 2019, police announced a new direction in the investigation and released an updated sketch, this one showing a younger man with curly hair, bearing almost no resemblance to the original drawing. The shift suggested that investigators had significantly reconceptualized who they were looking for, but the reconceptualization did not yield results. The question that defines this case emerges from this gap. How did a crime so thoroughly documented remain unresolved for so long? The answer, when it finally came, was neither particularly complex nor particularly flattering to the investigation itself. In September of 2022, a volunteer file clerk working to organize public tips discovered a document in a storage box. The document contained the name Richard Matthew Allen. The tip had been submitted to police in the early days of the investigation. It had been recorded incorrectly on the original submission form, and it had been marked cleared, a designation that removed it from active consideration and then filed away, essentially lost from the case record. The tip contained the essential fact that would later lead to arrest. Allen stated that he had been on the trails on February 13th, between 1:30 and 3:30 in the afternoon. That was the exact window during which the girls disappeared. When the file clerk recognized the timeline match, she submitted the recovered document to the lead detective. Within weeks, investigators executed a search warrant at Allen's home. 2 weeks after that, on October 26, 2022, Allen was arrested. What followed was a trial that, in many ways, replicated the earlier condition of the case. Thoroughly documented, yet contested. Prosecution presented a confession, or rather, 63 confessions that Allen made while incarcerated, statements he made to his wife, to his mother, to a psychologist, to other inmates. A firearms examiner testified that a bullet cartridge recovered near the crime scene had been cycled through Allen's specific handgun. A state trooper testified that he recognized Allen's voice in the recording saying, "Guys, down the hill." Multiple witnesses testified to having seen a man on the trail that day matching the appearance of the man in the video. But the defense presented an alternative account of the evidence. No DNA linked Allen to either girl. No fingerprints linked him to the crime scene. No fibers, no soil, no blood, no physical evidence of any kind recovered from Allen's body, his home, or his vehicles had been found at the scene. The confessions, according to a psychiatrist who examined Allen, had been made while he was in a state of psychological deterioration brought on by months of solitary confinement. On November 11th, after 19 hours of deliberation over 4 days, the jury found Richard Matthew Allen guilty on all 4 counts. The conviction has been appealed. The defense announced its intention to pursue a new trial. 19 of the 137 court documents in the case remain sealed. The cause of death, as documented in the autopsy report, has not been released to the public. The specific weapon used to inflict the injuries remains redacted in official documents. The motive for the crime was never definitively established at trial, and the question of whether anyone else was involved. The prosecutor himself, in a filing in 2022, had indicated he believed others may have been involved in the slayings, remains not only unanswered but officially unexamined. The Delphi murders case represents a particular type of unresolved year. Not a case unsolved for decades, waiting for forensic technology or cold case investigators to find the answer, but rather a case that was solved, convicted, and sentenced while remaining, in many essential respects, unresolved. The finality of a jury verdict and a prison sentence did not resolve the investigative questions that had accumulated over 8 years. It did not clarify how a documented crime remained cold for so long. It did not account for the evidentiary gaps that remain even after conviction. And it did not provide the understanding that victims' families and the community might reasonably expect from a case presented so publicly, documented so thoroughly, and concluded so definitively. What the new evidence actually shows is not what happened. Rather, it shows what the investigation reveals about the limits of documentation, the gaps in process, and the distance that can exist between the fact of guilt and the understanding of how a crime was committed. Delphi, Indiana is a small town in Carroll County, roughly 90 miles north of Indianapolis. The town itself sits inland, away from major highways, the kind of place where local geography matters, where residents know the trails and the creek beds and the old railroad trestles that mark the landscape. On February 13, 2017, the weather in Delphi was cool, but not freezing. It was a Monday afternoon. At 1:30 that afternoon, a young woman named Kelsey German dropped her sister Liberty, who was 14, and Liberty's friend Abigail Williams, who was 13, at a parking area on County Road 300 North, near the entrance to the Monon High Bridge Trail. The Monon High Bridge is an abandoned railroad trestle that spans the landscape with significant height and visibility. It is a destination for local hikers. Both girls had been to the trail before. Kelsey German watched her sister and her sister's friend walk toward the trail entrance, and then she drove away. The exact sequence of what occurred after that point is known only through the evidence that was preserved. At approximately 2:13 in the afternoon, less than an hour after being dropped off, Liberty German stood on the Monon High Bridge platform and activated the video recording function on her iPhone 6s. The phone had adequate battery charge. The phone had cellular service. What she recorded is approximately 35 to 40 seconds of video documentation of a man walking toward her and her friend on the bridge platform. The man in the video is not clearly identifiable from his face. His body is visible. His clothing is visible. He is walking directly toward the two girls, who are also visible in the frame, walking away from him down the bridge. The audio captured by the phone's microphone contains the voices of the two girls. It contains the voice of the man. The man's voice is muffled, but intelligible. He says the words, "Guys, down the hill." The video ends. The recording stops. What is documented on the phone from this point forward consists only of data, the movement data recorded by the Apple Health application running on the device in Liberty German's pocket. At 2:32 and 39 seconds in the afternoon, that movement data registers its final entry. Liberty German stopped moving. The exact cause of that cessation is not documented in any public record. The exact location where she stopped moving is not specified in any released document. The time at which her life ended is inferred from this data point, but the actual moment of death was not witnessed by anyone present in investigative records, and was not documented with certainty in any autopsy finding released to the public. Approximately 19 minutes passed between the moment that video was recorded and the moment that movement ceased. The girls were reported missing that evening when they did not return to the location where they had been dropped off. A search was initiated. By the following afternoon, on February 14th, search volunteers working in the densely wooded area north of Deer Creek, the creek that runs beneath the Monon High Bridge, discovered two bodies. The bodies were located approximately a quarter mile from the bridge platform where the video had been recorded. The bodies were approximately 30 to 40 feet apart from each other. Both bodies bore visible wounds to the throat. Both bodies had sustained substantial blood loss. One of the bodies was clothed in her own clothing. One of the bodies was partially nude. Scattered in the creek south of where the bodies lay were items of clothing belonging to the girls. A sock was missing. A pair of underwear was missing and was never recovered. Items of clothing that should have been present were not present. The bodies appeared, according to law enforcement documentation, to have been moved from the location where the injuries had been sustained. Blood evidence at the scene suggested a substantial loss from both victims. But the configuration of the bodies and the distribution of the blood suggested movement after the initial violence had occurred. Sticks and branches were placed over and around the bodies. Whether this represented an attempt at concealment or whether it represented some other intention was not formally determined in any released investigative document. By the afternoon of February 14th, less than 24 hours after the girls were dropped off at the trail entrance, both bodies had been transported to the Terre Haute County Coroner's Office for autopsy. By the evening of February 15th, law enforcement held a press conference and confirmed the identities of the deceased. Simultaneously, law enforcement announced the discovery of additional evidence. A video on Liberty German's cellular phone showing a man on the bridge platform at the approximate time the girls had disappeared. The video was described as depicting a suspected killer. The term bridge guy entered the investigative vocabulary and would remain there for the next 8 years. The autopsy was conducted on February 15, 2017. Dr. Roland Kaur, the pathologist, documented specific injuries to both victims. Abigail Williams bore one wound on the side of her neck, measuring approximately 7 inches in length. The wound characteristics suggested a serrated edge instrument. There were no defensive wounds documented. There was no evidence of sexual assault. Liberty German bore 4 to 5 wounds on her neck. 3 of the major blood vessels in her neck had been severed. The pathologist determined that based on the nature of the injuries, Liberty German would have lost consciousness and died within approximately 5 to 10 minutes of the wounding. Like Abigail Williams, Liberty German bore no defensive wounds. There was no evidence of sexual assault. Both autopsies documented large amounts of blood loss. Both documented the absence of any visible signs of struggle or fight. The specific weapon used to create the wounds was not disclosed to the public. In official documents, it was described only as redacted weapon, a notation that indicated the specific instrument had been identified by investigators but was being withheld from public knowledge. The cause of death itself, the formal medical determination of how and why the girls died, was sealed and not released. By February 22nd, 19 days after the crime, law enforcement released an audio recording to the public. The recording was approximately 13 seconds in duration. It contained the muffled male voice saying, "Down the hill." Police indicated that additional evidence had been recovered from the phone but was being withheld to protect the integrity of any future prosecution. A reward was established, $41,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person responsible. The investigation had entered its initial public phase. The evidence appeared substantial and relatively complete. The crime had been documented by the victim herself. The suspect's voice had been captured. Eyewitnesses on the trail that day might be able to provide descriptions. The autopsy had established the nature of the injuries. The crime scene had been secured. What should have followed was a relatively direct investigative trajectory from documented evidence to suspect identification to arrest. Instead, what followed was a prolonged investigation that would consume the next 8 years. The early days of the investigation produced activity without apparent progress. Law enforcement conducted interviews with witnesses who had been on the trail on February 13th. 3 juveniles were interviewed who reported having passed a man between the Freedom Bridge and the Mononhai Bridge on the day of the girl's disappearance. Their descriptions were recorded. One described the man as having gray hair with brown coloring, wearing a light blue jacket and blue jeans. Another described him as dressed entirely in black, with something covering his mouth, not very tall, with a bigger build, wearing black boots, with his hands in his pockets. A third described him as walking with purpose, dressed in many layers despite warm weather. The descriptions were inconsistent with each other in several respects, which is typical of eyewitness accounts when multiple people observe the same person under different conditions and from different distances. But all 3 descriptions contained elements that would prove relevant to the investigation. A man of indeterminate, but not particularly tall stature, in the area of the bridge on the day the crime occurred. Additionally, a woman named Sarah Carbaugh reported that at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon on February 13th, hours after the video was recorded and likely after the girls had already died, she encountered a man walking alongside a road near the bridge area. She stated that this man was covered in mud and blood and that he did not make eye contact with her. When police later released a photograph allegedly depicting the bridge guy, Carbaugh identified the image as resembling the man she had seen. On July 17, 2017, police released the first composite sketch. The sketch depicted an older man with a goatee, based on the collective descriptions of witnesses who had been on the trail that day. The sketch was distributed to media outlets and the public. Viewers were asked to contact police if they recognized the person depicted. In March of 2017, an FBI agent filed a search warrant seeking access to materials at the home of Ronald Logan, a property owner whose land was adjacent to the crime scene area. The warrant contained language indicating that law enforcement suspected Logan of possible involvement in the crime. The warrant noted that the victims had suffered a large amount of blood loss and had displayed no visible signs of struggle or fight. The warrant stated that the murder weapon had been described as redacted weapon, again, a specific instrument withheld from public knowledge. The search warrant language indicated active investigation. But the investigation of Ronald Logan, despite FBI speculation and intensive questioning, ultimately yielded no evidence linking him to the crime. He was not charged. The focus of the investigation shifted, but to where, or to what specific lead, was not disclosed to the public. The investigation continued, but the momentum diminished. Months passed, then a year, then 2 years. By 2019, the case had been formally designated a cold case. No arrest had been made. No suspects had been publicly named. The video remained available to the public. The audio remained available. But the investigative apparatus had essentially stalled. In April of 2019, more than 2 years after the crime, Indiana State Police announced a new direction in the investigation. Simultaneously, they released an updated composite sketch. This sketch bore almost no resemblance to the one released in 2017. Where the 2017 sketch had depicted an older man with a goatee, the 2019 sketch depicted a younger man with curly hair. The shift was dramatic, and it indicated that investigators had significantly reconceptualized who they believed the suspect to be. The new composite sketch was based on eyewitness accounts from a single additional witness, a hiker who had been on the trail on February 13th and who had encountered a man on the bridge area. Whether this single additional account was sufficient to render the 2017 sketch obsolete, or whether the 2019 update reflected investigative reorientation based on other factors, was not explained. Simultaneously with the release of the new composite, police released additional audio from Liberty German's phone. The new audio was longer than the 13-second clip released in 2017. The additional audio contained more context, more of the male voice, additional statements. But despite providing more information, the audio still did not result in a clear, definitive identification of the speaker. Police also announced a new investigative focus. They were seeking the driver of a vehicle that had been abandoned on Hoosier Heartland Highway at the location of a former Child Protective Services building on February 13th between noon and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The vehicle, according to police announcements, might belong to or be connected to the person they were seeking. The announcement of the new direction included a statement from Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter. Carter indicated that the suspect was almost certainly familiar with Delphi area from living there, working there, or other reasons. Carter suggested that the suspect was likely hiding in plain sight, implying that the person they were seeking was present in the community, possibly watching the news conference itself, possibly known to investigators or witnesses, but not yet definitively identified. For the next 3 years, from 2019 to 2022, the investigation remained in this state. Active in the sense that investigators continued to conduct interviews and pursue leads, but stalled in the sense that no arrest was made, no suspect was publicly identified, and no substantial progress appeared to be achieved. Theories circulated in media and online forums. Investigators pursued alternative leads. The property owner Ronald Logan continued to be investigated, but the case remained unresolved. The video remained unsolved. The audio remained unmatched to any identified individual. The absence of progress began to wear on the community. Months became years. The victims' families had to live with the investigation ongoing around them, neither resolved nor abandoned. The town of Delphi had to carry the weight of 2 unsolved murders. Media coverage persisted, but shifted from active investigative reporting to periodic updates on the lack of progress. 5 years passed. 5 years and 7 months had elapsed from the afternoon of February 13, 2017, when Liberty German recorded that 35 to 40-second video, until September of 2022, when the investigative breakthrough finally occurred. The breakthrough was not the result of a technological advancement or a forensic innovation. It was the result of administrative oversight being corrected. In September of 2022, a volunteer working to organize and file public tips submitted to law enforcement discovered a document in a storage box. The document was a tip that had been submitted to police early in the investigation. The tip contained the name Richard Matthew Allen. The tip had been recorded, but the recording had been incomplete or inaccurate. The name had been misspelled or misrecorded. The tip had been marked as cleared, meaning it had been investigated or dismissed, and was removed from active consideration. The cleared tip had then been filed away and essentially lost from the case record. When the volunteer file clerk reviewed the recovered tip, she recognized that the timeline described in the tip, a statement that Allen had been on the trails between 1:30 and 3:30 on February 13th, matched exactly with the time frame of the girl's disappearance. She submitted the recovered document to the lead detective. The detective began an active investigation of Richard Allen. Richard Allen was not unknown to law enforcement. Allen had been interviewed by police in the early days of the investigation in 2017. In that interview, Allen had stated that he had been on the trails on February 13th between 1:30 and 3:30 in the afternoon. He had stated that he had walked from the Monon High Bridge toward the Freedom Bridge. He had stated that he went to the bridge to watch fish. He had stated that he wore jeans and a black or blue jacket that day. Investigative records from the time of that 2017 interview indicated that there was corroborating evidence for Allen's presence at the location. Business surveillance video from 1:27 in the afternoon on February 13th showed a vehicle matching the description of Allen's 2016 black Ford Focus traveling westbound on County Road 300 North, consistent with a 1:30 arrival time at the trail entrance. When the tip was recovered in September of 2022, the investigative apparatus focused on Richard Allen for the first time with sustained attention. Within weeks, on October 13, 2022, investigators executed a search warrant at Allen's home. Items were recovered: jackets, boots, knives, firearms. On October 26, 2022, Richard Allen, who had continued to live in Delphi and work at a local CVS pharmacy in the intervening years, went voluntarily to the Indiana State Police Post. In a statement to investigators, Allen said he had never allowed anyone to borrow his Sig Sauer Model P226 handgun. He stated he had no explanation for why a bullet cartridge found at the crime scene would have come from his weapon. That same day, October 26th, Richard Allen was arrested on suspicion of murder. 2 days later, formal charges were filed, 2 counts of felony murder. The investigation that had stalled for 5 years and 7 months had finally produced an arrest. The decision to arrest Richard Allen was based on the recovery of the misfiled tip and on what investigators had learned when they began examining Allen's documented timeline and the evidence surrounding his statement. But understanding what led to that decision requires examining what Allen had actually said in his 2017 interview and what the corroborating evidence showed. Allen's statement in 2017 was specific and detailed. He stated he had been on the trails that day. He stated he had arrived at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon. He stated he had parked at what he described as the old Farm Bureau building. Investigators noted that no Farm Bureau building existed in the area. They concluded Allen had likely been referring to the former Child Protective Services building, which was the abandoned structure located in the area where vehicles had been observed parked. Notably, in April of 2019, more than a year after Allen's initial interview, police announced that they were seeking information about a vehicle abandoned on Hoosier Heartland Highway at the location of the former Child Protective Services building on the afternoon of February 13th. This was the exact location Allen had described, using different terminology, in his 2017 statement. The 2017 interview indicated that Allen had observed the girls. He stated that he had seen girls on the trails east of Freedom Bridge before he went to the Monon High Bridge. His description of his route from the Monon High Bridge toward the Freedom Bridge placed him directly in the area where the girls had disappeared. The corroborating evidence supported his timeline. The surveillance video showed a vehicle matching his description arriving at the area at the correct time. His statement about his clothing, jeans and a black or blue jacket, matched descriptions provided by trail witnesses who had encountered a man on the trail that day. In his initial statement, Allen had stated he was innocent of involvement in the crime. He had provided his alibi. He had placed himself at the location. He had described his clothing and his activities. And then, despite all of this, he had not been arrested. The tip had been misfiled. The interview had been conducted, but apparently not flagged as significant. 5 years passed. When investigators finally focused on Allen in September of 2022, a search warrant was executed at his home. The search recovered, among other items, a Sig Sauer Model P226 handgun. This weapon matched the caliber of the cartridge that had been recovered near Liberty German's body at the crime scene. An Indiana State Police firearms examiner examined the cartridge. The examiner testified that the unspent round had been cycled through Allen's specific handgun. This finding was presented as evidence that the round had been fired from, or at least loaded into and extracted from, Allen's weapon. Additionally, investigators examined Allen's cellular phone records, his financial records, and his movements. They interviewed Allen's family members. They conducted a comprehensive investigation of Allen's activities, his contacts, and his background. By the time the trial began in October of 2024, investigators had compiled what appeared to be a substantial case. The case included the ballistic evidence from the recovered cartridge. The case included witness testimony from people who had been on the trail that day. The case included evidence that Allen had been in the area at the time the crime occurred. The case included statements Allen had made after his arrest. But the case did not include DNA evidence linking Allen to the victims or the crime scene. The case did not include fingerprint evidence. The case did not include clothing fibers, soil samples, or any trace evidence recovered from Allen, his home, or his vehicles that connected him to the crime scene. The case did not include direct evidence of how the crime was committed. The case did not include evidence explaining the motive for the crime. What the case did include, in significant volume, was confession evidence. In April of 2023, 6 months after his arrest and incarceration at Westville Correctional Facility, Richard Allen began making confessions. Over the course of 18 months, Allen made approximately 60 to 63 confessions. He confessed to his wife. He confessed to his mother. He confessed to a psychologist employed at the correctional facility, a woman named Dr. Monica Walla. He confessed to correctional facility staff. He confessed to other inmates. The confessions were consistent in their basic content. Allen admitted to killing Abigail Williams and Liberty German. Allen provided statements that were interpreted by prosecutors as admissions of guilt. Dr. Walla testified that Allen had initially denied involvement in the crime, but had subsequently begun confessing, including telling her directly, "I killed Abby and Libby." The confessions began after Allen was placed on suicide watch and transferred to more intensive custody conditions. The confessions continued through the period of pretrial investigation and preparation. By the time the trial began, a substantial record of confession statements existed. For the prosecution, this record of confessions was presented as powerful evidence of guilt. 63 separate admissions of guilt, across multiple witnesses and settings, suggested that Allen had deliberately and repeatedly acknowledged his responsibility for the crime. For the defense, this same record presented a different narrative. Allen's psychiatric evaluations, conducted by a defense psychiatrist, indicated that Allen had become psychotic, disconnected from reality, experiencing delusions, unable to distinguish fact from fiction. The defense psychiatrist testified that Allen's mental state had deteriorated significantly during his incarceration, particularly during periods of solitary confinement. The defense position was that the confessions had not been voluntary admissions of guilt, but rather statements made by a person whose mental condition had been compromised by the conditions of his confinement. This fundamental disagreement about the nature and reliability of the confessions would define much of the trial. The trial began on October 18, 2024, with jury selection conducted in Fort Wayne, approximately 90 miles from Delphi. The trial itself was held in Carroll County, Delphi's home county, but the jury was brought from Allen County, Fort Wayne's county, to ensure impartiality in a case that had received substantial local media attention. Presiding Judge Fran Gull, a special judge assigned to the case, oversaw 17 days of testimony. The prosecution presented evidence in several categories. The first was the ballistic evidence. The cartridge recovered near Liberty German's body and the determination that it had been cycled through Richard Allen's Sig Sauer handgun. The prosecution's firearms examiner testified that the cartridge showed marks consistent with having been loaded into and extracted from Allen's weapon. The examiner presented this as evidence linking Allen directly to the crime scene. If the cartridge had come from Allen's gun, the logic suggested, then Allen had been present at the crime scene and had been armed with that weapon at the time. The defense presented a firearms expert who challenged this interpretation. The defense expert testified that the comparison methodology was flawed, that the examination amounted to what the expert characterized as an apples to oranges comparison. The defense expert raised technical questions about the validity of the ballistic match and suggested that the methodology did not meet standards for definitive firearms identification. This technical dispute, whether the ballistic evidence represented a reliable match or a flawed analysis, would remain contested through the trial's conclusion and into the appeals process. The prosecution also presented digital evidence. Investigators brought Liberty German's iPhone 6s into the courtroom. They played the 35 to 40-second video recording made at 2:13 in the afternoon on February 13th. They played the audio recording of the male voice saying, "Guys, down the hill." They presented data from the Apple Health application showing the last recorded movement at 2:32 in the afternoon. A state trooper testified that he had listened to approximately 700 telephone calls recorded between Richard Allen and other parties while Allen was in custody. Based on this extensive exposure to Allen's voice, the trooper testified that he recognized Allen's voice in the audio recording saying, "Guys, down the hill." This voice identification was presented as evidence placing Allen at the crime scene and tying him directly to the evidence recorded on the victim's own phone. The defense did not present independent voice analysis or expert testimony challenging this identification, but the defense raised the question, What methodology had been used to make this voice identification? How had the trooper been trained in voice identification? What independent verification had been conducted? The answers to these questions were not provided with the detail that would typically be expected in a forensic analysis. The prosecution presented witness testimony from people who had been on the trail on February 13th. Multiple witnesses testified that they had seen a man on the trail that day matching the appearance of the man visible in the video. These witnesses provided descriptions of clothing, demeanor, and approximate location. The witnesses testified consistently enough that a coherent picture emerged. A man had been present on the trail in the area where the girls disappeared, at approximately the time the girls disappeared. But none of these witnesses testified that they had specifically identified Richard Allen as the man they had seen. The identifications were based on description matching. The man they had seen on the trail matched the appearance of the man visible in the video. The video itself, while clearly showing a man on the bridge platform, does not show his face with sufficient clarity for definitive identification. The prosecution presented its most substantial body of evidence in the form of confession testimony. Family members testified that Allen had confessed to them. Correctional facility staff testified that Allen had confessed to them. Other inmates testified that Allen had confessed to them. Dr. Monica Walla, the psychologist, testified that Allen had confessed to her and had stated, "I killed Abby and Libby." Prosecutors played audio recordings of some of these confessions. The effect was cumulative. Witness after witness testified that Allen had admitted guilt. Audio recordings of those admissions were presented. By the end of the prosecution's presentation of confession evidence, the jury had been exposed to multiple sources of Allen's alleged admission. The defense presented a substantially different picture of the evidence. The defense presented no DNA evidence linking Allen to either victim or the crime scene. The defense presented no fingerprint evidence linking Allen to the crime scene. The defense presented no fibers, no soil, no blood, no trace evidence of any kind recovered from Allen's body, his home, or his vehicles that had been found at the crime scene. The absence of this evidence was, the defense argued, extraordinary. In a violent crime involving substantial blood loss, the complete absence of any physical trace evidence linking the suspect to the crime scene was, in the defense's characterization, a significant problem for the prosecution's case. The defense presented psychiatric testimony regarding Allen's mental state. A defense psychiatrist testified that Allen had become psychotic while incarcerated. The psychiatrist testified that Allen had experienced delusions, that his grip on reality had deteriorated, particularly after extended periods in solitary confinement. The psychiatrist testified that in this mental state, Allen would be susceptible to confessing to crimes he did not commit, to accepting false narratives, to becoming confused about fact and fiction. The defense emphasized that Allen had lived openly in Delphi for 5 years and 7 months after the crime. If Allen had committed the crime, the defense argued, why would he remain in the town where the crime occurred? Why would he not flee? Why would he present himself to police interviews, provide an alibi, continue to work at a local pharmacy, and live in the community? The defense also questioned the investigative process itself. The defense noted that a tip containing Allen's name had been misfiled for over 5 years. The defense noted that Allen had been interviewed early in the investigation and had provided a statement that placed him at the crime scene. If the investigative apparatus had been functioning properly, the defense argued, Allen would have been arrested in 2017. The fact that he was not arrested until 2022 suggested investigative failure, not investigative confirmation of guilt. The trial lasted 17 days. Jury deliberations lasted 19 hours over 4 days. On November 11, 2024, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all 4 counts. The verdict meant that the jury had concluded, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Richard Allen had murdered Abigail Williams and Liberty German. The jury had concluded that the prosecution had proven its case. The jury had concluded that the evidence presented, taken as a whole, demonstrated guilt. But the jury's verdict did not resolve the contested nature of the evidence. It did not settle the dispute about the ballistic analysis. It did not establish the reliability of the voice identification. It did not explain the absence of physical trace evidence. It did not clarify whether the confessions were voluntary admissions or products of psychological deterioration. The verdict was guilty, but the questions remained. On December 20th, 2024, Richard Allen was sentenced to 130 years in prison 65 years per murder count, to be served consecutively. Judge Gull stated that the crime ranks right up there with the most hideous crimes. The maximum sentence available was imposed. The conviction and sentencing of Richard Allen was presented in media coverage as the resolution of the case. The uncertainty had ended. The families could move forward. The town could move on. The case was closed. In the formal legal record, the case is closed. Richard Allen is incarcerated and serving his sentence. The investigation that began on February 14, 2017, when search volunteers discovered 2 bodies in a wooded area north of Deer Creek, has concluded with a conviction and incarceration. But the practical closure that the verdict and sentence might have provided is incomplete. Defense attorneys have announced their intention to appeal. The appeal process will require examination of the trial evidence, the trial procedure, and the validity of the conviction. A court reporter is preparing a full transcript of the trial testimony. Once that transcript is complete, the defense will have 30 days to file an initial appeal brief. The legal dispute about the validity of the conviction is not resolved. It is suspended, pending appellate review. Simultaneously, significant evidence remains under seal. 19 of the 137 court documents in the case are not available to the public. The cause of death, as documented in the autopsy report, has not been released. The specific weapon used to inflict the injuries remains redacted in official documents. The full details of the investigative interviews conducted with Richard Allen and the investigative assessment of his statements have not been disclosed. The motive for the crime was not definitively established at trial. The prosecution suggested that the crime had been an attempted sexual assault that was thwarted when a passing van appeared at an inopportune moment. But the autopsy findings documented no evidence of sexual assault. There were no torn clothes, no internal injuries, no biological evidence. The motive suggested by the prosecution contradicted the forensic findings. The prosecutor himself, in a filing submitted in November of 2022, before charges were even formally filed, had indicated that he believed others may have been involved in the slayings. That assessment was never formally investigated. No other suspects were charged. No investigation into possible co-perpetrators was made public. But the prosecutor's own statement suggested that the crime might not have been committed by Richard Allen alone. The case file contains 19 sealed documents. What those documents contain, why they have been sealed, and what information they might provide to understanding the crime is not publicly known. The prosecutor's office has filed motions to maintain the seal on crime scene photographs, autopsy photographs, and mental health evaluations related to Richard Allen. These documents are, in the view of prosecutors, material that should remain confidential despite the conviction and sentencing. The investigative timeline itself contains a gap that remains unexplained. Richard Allen was interviewed by police in 2017. His statement was recorded. It placed him at the crime scene at the correct time. It included details that were corroborated, the surveillance video showing a vehicle matching his description of his clothing matching witness accounts. Yet he was not arrested. The tip containing his name was misfiled. 5 years and 7 months passed. When the tip was finally recovered, it took only weeks for investigators to execute a search warrant and make an arrest. Once the investigative focus was placed on Allen, the case moved quickly. This raises the question, why did the initial investigation fail to pursue Allen? What administrative, procedural, or investigative failure allowed a tip naming a person placed at the crime scene at the critical time to be lost for over 5 years? The investigative record contains no satisfactory answer to this question. The sheriff of Carroll County, Tony Liggett, acknowledged at the sentencing hearing that Allen had got lost in the cracks during the initial investigation. Liggett apologized to the families for the 8-year timeline required to achieve resolution. But the acknowledgement and apology did not resolve the question of how the investigative process had failed so completely. The investigative failure was not a result of lack of evidence. The video was available. The audio was available. The crime scene was secured and processed. Witness interviews were conducted. The autopsy was completed. The evidence was there. What was lacking was investigative execution, the process of taking the available evidence and pursuing it to its logical conclusion. Instead, the available evidence was not pursued. The tip was misfiled. The initial interview was not flagged as significant. The case stalled, and it remained stalled until an administrative correction, the recovery of the misfiled tip, reoriented the investigation. What the Delphi murders case demonstrates is a particular condition of modern American crime investigation: the distance between evidence and understanding. The crime was documented. The video shows a man present at the crime scene. The audio captures his voice. The victims are identified. The crime scene is secured. But the documentation of the crime does not necessarily lead to the understanding of the crime. The guilty verdict established a legal fact: Richard Allen killed Abigail Williams and Liberty German. That is the finding of the jury, on the record, and it is not disputed here. But the verdict does not establish how the crime was committed. It does not explain what weapon was used, or how those wounds were inflicted, or whether the injuries were sustained simultaneously or sequentially, or whether the girls were conscious when attacked, or whether they struggled, or how long they lived after being wounded. The verdict does not establish the motive. It does not establish whether the crime was premeditated or impulsive. It does not establish the specific sequence of events that led to the girls being in the wooded area where they were found. It does not establish what happened to the missing clothing. It does not establish what happened during those 19 minutes between the video recording and the last recorded movement. The verdict does not address the prosecutor's statement that others may have been involved. It does not address the sealed documents, or what information they contain, or why they have been withheld. The verdict is definitive on one point: guilt. But on the question of understanding, on the question of what actually happened, and how, and why, the verdict provides no comprehensive answer. The evidence remains contested. The methodology remains questioned. The full narrative of the crime remains incomplete. The case is closed in the sense that a sentence has been imposed and an individual is incarcerated. But the case is unresolved in the fundamental sense that understanding has not been achieved. The finality of the verdict has not produced the clarity that the documentation of the crime seemed to promise. This is what unresolved years mysteries means in the context of modern American criminal justice. Not a case abandoned, not a crime unsolved, but rather a crime solved and convicted and sentenced while remaining, in essential respects, fundamentally misunderstood. The verdict provides closure. Understanding remains incomplete. I'm Marcus Webb, and if you're new here, subscribe and join us. We're building something serious, and your support allows us to research deeper, produce better, and uncover stories others overlook. Like, share, and be part of it.